Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Today we are back with yet another one of the APA Guidelines for men and boys. You may recall the last guideline kind of forgot the whole reason it even existed and sort of just rambled on about barely relevant tangents instead. Is this guideline going to be any better? Well, let's just say that I wouldn't suggest holding your breath on that one. Anyway, let's dig into Guideline 7. Guideline 7. Psychologists strive to reduce the high rates of problems boys and men face and act out in their lives, such as aggression, violence, substance abuse, and suicide. Rationale. Although the vast majority of males are not violent, boys and men commit nearly 90% of violent crimes in the United States. This is a very unusual point to start us off on. Before we even discuss the content of this statement, I'd like to play the pedantry card for a minute and demonstrate how, even if we insisted on keeping this little factoid in here, there's a better way that this could be presented. Allow me to demonstrate. Although it is true that 90% of violent crimes in the United States are committed by men, it is important to recognize that the vast majority of males are not violent. Do we see how the focus of the sentence changes? People's attention is naturally drawn to the latter half of the sentence, where the emphasis normally falls. So, in this statement, are we wanting to emphasize that men commit the majority of the violent crime? Or are we wanting to emphasize that most men are not violent, and that therefore we as therapists should probably avoid the highly problematic assumption that they are? If we are, for some peculiar reason, wanting to focus on the fact that men commit the majority of violent crime, then the question I would want to ask is, why? As a therapist who works primarily with male clients, I can tell you that I can count on one hand the number of men who have indicated that violence is or even was a problem for them. I'm not saying there aren't violent men, or that therapists who work with that population shouldn't be aware of some of the potential contributing factors, but I am saying that starting off one of the general guidelines for working with men and boys in this manner suggests assumptions that probably shouldn't be present here. So let's go ahead and see what they do with it. Many boys and men have been socialized to use aggression and violence as a means to resolve interpersonal conflict. Family, peers, and media often reinforce the connection between aggressive behavior and masculinity. Do they, though? Just about everything I see on a regular basis readily demonizes even the implication of violence. Think stories like children being expelled from school over making finger guns. And I'm pretty sure most little boys who engage in rough and tumble play were hardly encouraged to do so by their parents or anyone other than other little boys with their very ample energy. And if you think it's only little boys who engage in this kind of play, as someone with 2 daughters, no, it's not. Growing up, I was asked if I wanted to fight and threatened violence by other girls my own age, and unsurprisingly, much of this kind of behavior originated in children from low-income families. I say unsurprisingly because we have long known that violent behavior tends to be greatest in impoverished neighborhoods, especially in those where gang activity is present. As a family and community-minded individual, I have had the pleasure of talking with many other parents of young children, including boys, and I have never heard anyone actively socializing their children to use violence to solve interpersonal conflict, other than some parents occasionally enrolling their children in things like karate or taekwondo, but I think we'd be seriously stretching the word violence to count these activities in that vein. As already indicated, schools often have very strict no-violence policies, and very rarely is such behavior supported in any other extracurricular activities. So I really wonder where these guys are getting the idea that many boys are socialized this way. Did the author grow up on the streets of Detroit or something? Honestly, though. Childhood physical and/or sexual abuse victimization has been found to be a significant precursor to aggressive behavior in boys and men. Other risk factors for aggressive behavior include poor parental and teacher supervision, low academic achievement, frequent viewing of violent media, and living in high-crime neighborhoods. So, It's good that they do mention these things, but again, as I mentioned before, these are hardly risk factors for men and boys alone. For some men, perpetrating violence, including violence against gender-diverse people, serves to protect and enhance the perpetrator's own masculinity. Therefore, aggression may serve as public behavior wherein men can prove their masculinity, either against worthy rival or against those considered unworthy of the label man, in order to bolster confidence in their masculine identity. Again, I feel like this does happen, but it's hardly a common thing. As mentioned, you tend to see this more in impoverished or alcohol, drug, or gang-related circumstances. There are also men who act tough in various situations, such as for social posturing or pecking order reasons, or simply as a warning for others to keep away, but who would either never engage in actual violence or who would much prefer to avoid it. But if we're talking about having confidence in a masculine identity, you know what's far more common? Feeling self-sufficient and capable, feeling like they have a purpose in life, feeling like they can be a provider and that others can rely on them, feeling like they have someone who loves, desires, and cares about them. I see all of these things far more often than I see men who think being violent makes them look manly. In fact, I'd argue that more men would state that becoming violent in a situation would be tantamount to losing control and composure, which is the opposite of most men's image of masculinity. I really do wonder if any of the folks involved with writing this document ever actually talked to any men, or if they just relied on television shows and extreme stereotypes to draft this stuff. Yikes. Fortunately, though, the next paragraph seems to be a little bit more on the right track. Men are at high risk of being the victims of violent crime. For African American males ages 10 to 24, homicide is the leading cause of death. It is the second leading cause of death for Hispanic youth of the same ages. Men who have experienced violence and abuse in childhood are more likely to have higher rates of mental illness. Men who are violent toward their partners are more likely to have been physically abused and/or witnessed domestic violence as children than those who are not violent. Okay, great. All accurate, no problems here. Then it takes a bit of an odd turn. Gender-diverse men are disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system and incarcerated. For example, documented rates of arrest for transgender and gender non-conforming people range from 35 to 72%, and 35% of transgender people have been victimized while imprisoned by inmates and guards. You know, it's not that I'm against talking about this stuff. Obviously, I know that transgender individuals have their own struggles that deserve to be addressed. But putting it in a document that is supposed to be about men and boys just feels like you are shoehorning something in where it doesn't belong. Don't misinterpret my words to be obtuse there either. You know for an absolute fact that the social dynamics and pressures on men who grew up as boys will be dramatically different than the social dynamics and pressures on transgender men who grew up as girls, to say nothing of the way they experience their lives. Even in this statement I just highlighted, which is rather vague, by the way, are we talking about transgender men, transgender women, both? Transgender individuals of any stripe will absolutely experience incarceration very differently from men, from the facility they are placed into, to the relations with other inmates, to the kinds of victimization they may be prone to and the reasoning behind said victimization. It all just begs the question of why are we talking about it here other than for social justice brownie points? Suicide rates are also higher for men who have been abused or witnessed abuse in childhood, and men in general constituted more than 70% of suicide deaths in the United States between 2000 and 2012. Childhood suicide rates have increased among school-aged African American males in relation to white males. Okay, fine. The wording of the last sentence strikes me as being a little oddly specific and divisive, but whatever, par for the course. In addition, suicide rates in men over 70 are higher than in any other demographic group worldwide. The suicide rates of American Indian and Alaska Native men have increased by 38% in recent years. In epidemiological studies, substance abuse and alcohol abuse were correlated with higher suicide rates among men. Many men use alcohol or other drugs as a trauma-related avoidance response to difficult emotional situations and uncomfortable affective states, and investigators have uncovered strong links between alcohol and suicide completion. All right, again, fine, I have no issues with this section, but then we move into this. Although the depression rates among men are 50% that of women, researchers believe that many men express depression covertly, manifesting as irritability, interpersonal distancing, sensitivity to threats to self-esteem and self-respect, compulsivity, somatic complaints, and difficulty with motivation and concentration. Lending credence to the covert aspect of many men's depression are suicide rates 4 times that of women, despite the lower depression rate for men as defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, criteria. Now, this is actually not something where I have a problem specifically with this APA guideline. This is more something where I have a problem with how the general psychological field as a whole treats depression in general, especially regarding men. As stated here, we know for a fact, and have long known at that men often portray depression quite differently from women. Moreover, due to various social pressures, largely related to the ones I mentioned earlier, there are some men who will feel pressure to not show their depression, so as not to lose face or to avoid losing the respect of their partners or family, etc., and who would certainly not think about talking to a professional or reporting their symptoms such that they would receive a formal diagnosis. So, whenever I see claims of depression rates in men being so far below women's, I'm always immediately suspicious, and I believe others should be as well. Maybe, if the DSM definitions of depression are so far afield from men's experiences, it's time for them to establish a new definition. They then have a little paragraph talking about how details on other minority populations of men can be found in another report, which seems like it would be the ideal answer to my earlier complaint, but Anyway, on to the application section. Application. Psychologists strive to understand the multiple cultural and individual difference factors that lead to aggression and violence in men and boys, including the intersection of exposure to adverse childhood experiences and traditional masculine socialization where applicable. By having empathy for the causes, e.g., lack of personal and social resources to cope with trauma, of aggressive and violent behavior, psychologists strive to prevent violence by adopting trauma-sensitive and gender-sensitive approaches with young boys in schools, and by using psychological methods that increase empathy for others, model control of aggressive behavior, and increase communication skills or problem solving. Okay, so I hope this doesn't need to be said, but surely this only applies to cases where violence or aggression is actually mentioned, rather than assuming anything about our male clients. Seems silly to have to confirm, but based on a lot of assumptions we've already seen in this document, sadly not out of place. Otherwise, I have to agree with taking a trauma-sensitive approach and a focus on problem solving. From my experience, exploring what purpose aggression is serving in the client's life, as well as how it is not serving them, and working to find more productive ways to express that need is a good way to approach this topic. In educational, correctional, and therapeutic settings, psychologists are encouraged to work with boys and men who have had difficulties with aggression and violence, and to focus on treatment and remediation when working with incarcerated individuals. In such settings, psychologists strive to have empathy for men's traumatic pain while also holding them accountable for their behavior. Furthermore, given that further research is needed to understand the efficacy of violence intervention programs focused on men's issues, psychologists are encouraged to conduct such effectiveness studies and to test the consequences of modifying existing programs to include issues relevant to boys and men, e.g., rigid adherence to restrictive masculinity ideologies. I am encouraged that they are talking about conducting more effectiveness studies about violence intervention programs for men. I would hope that this would mean that there would be more of a focus on solutions and empathy about what men may have been through to get them into this position, and less of blaming men for inherent traits or qualities, especially when those qualities may have previously served them well in whatever situations they were in prior to seeking help. I would love to see more research that drives programs targeted at men in helpful directions, rather than directions that actually increase shame and self-loathing. But unfortunately, I've yet seen more of the latter than the former. Many boys and men do not willingly reveal the extent of childhood trauma to others. Psychologists are encouraged to be attentive to the shame many men feel about discussing abuse and emotional distress, and strive to remain empathetic, supportive, and patient with their interventions with boys and men who may manifest defensive and masked reactions to educational and therapeutic interventions. Psychologists are especially encouraged to assess for early psychological trauma in men who present for depression, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, and intimate partner violence. Psychologists strive to be aware of potential underlying affective disorders such as depression and anxiety when considering therapeutic interventions with men who display aggression and violence. Okay, so if they are legitimately wanting ideas on how to help men overcome the shame of revealing childhood trauma, there are a few things that I can suggest from my own personal research and direct counseling experience. First, you're going to want to provide a space where you are not engaging in blaming or shaming. It sounds obvious, and I feel like it should be, but looking over the last several guidelines, we can plainly see that it isn't. So what do I mean when I say this? Stop telling men that their interpersonal challenges are due to masculinity ideology or patriarchy, or otherwise make assumptions about the reasoning behind anything that they do. Provide legitimate empathy and understand that many of them have likely reached out for support before, only to be potentially shunned and turned away. Acknowledge that there is a general attitude in society that assumes men have all the power and privilege and therefore don't need help. Acknowledge that any stigma against men seeking help for their problems is not just because the men are too darn scared or embarrassed to get help for their problems, but rather because other people often belittle and shame them for not always being in control. And pro tip, this attitude often does not arise from other men, despite what many like to claim. Give men some sense that you legitimately understand and, dare I say it, care about their situation, and you'd be surprised how willing they become to talk about it. A small technical tip in getting your foot in the door regarding getting men to acknowledge traumas they may have experienced, especially for group settings. If you make use of initial intake questions or surveys or anything of that nature, a great way to explore men's experiences is to use a Likert-style scale, asking about various situations from a 1 to 5 rating. Many men, if asked directly, "Have you been abused?" or anything similar to that, will often say no, simply due to their perceptions of their experiences as being not that bad, or not bad enough to constitute abuse, or just having generally different definitions of things that have happened to them. If you instead use sample statements like, "I am afraid of my partner has thrown objects at me, my partner treats me with disrespect, I have been afraid to be fully honest with my partner," or things like that on a scale of 1, completely disagree, to 5, completely agree, you'll often not only have more men willing to answer these questions clearly, but you may even give them some insight into their own experiences as being abused that they may have never considered before. Similarly, if you want to assess men for depression, there are general scales talking about more general depression symptoms, such as the Beck Depression Inventory or the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, but there are also more specific to men tools, such as the Male Depression Risk Scale 22. If you want to be thorough in your assessment for risk, I would suggest using both with your clients. As previously stated, there are some depression signs that present differently in men versus in women, and so you will want to be thorough in exploring for this. I have talked before about other ways of helping men throughout the therapy process, and so I won't beat a dead horse and go into them here. But I just wanted to end this criticism of this guideline with some tangible tips for helping men. Don't want to look like I'm all criticism and no substance. Either way, that marks the end of this guideline. Not the worst of them, but still plenty to talk about. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.